All right, hello everybody, and welcome to this lecture on a number of things. This is going to be on general scientific literacy, and additionally what our paper will be about, so how you will be applying these topics to our projects. So let's go ahead and take a look. I start off talking about just the overview of the paper that we will be writing in this class. So our research paper is going to be a standard scientific research paper. We're going to have all of the major components of a research paper. You're going to have 5 pages of writing, okay? And I made an infographic to show you this on the next slide. Because we're going to have 5 pages of writing, kind of meat of the paper, in addition to some other pieces of the paper that are required of a research report, including things like a title page, an abstract, which is a summary of your project, and a reference page as well. We'll be using professionally respected sources, and that's sort of what we're here to talk about today. How do we use professional sources? How do we cite them? So we'll be going over all of that. I have here that you need to use 5 to 10. Most of us will be hedging on the larger side of that. And I know you might be thinking, wow, that's a lot of articles, right? It's a lot of things to read. But you'll come to find out that they'll all serve their own purpose, and that we're all going to sort of be working with different types of information. So we'll all kind of play this by ear. But a minimum of 5. You'll be collecting 10 for your references assignment, so you'll have plenty to pull from when you start to write your paper. And then lastly, it's going to follow APA. So we've talked about APA a little bit up until this point. APA is the American Psychological Association, and they have publication guidelines that we will follow to make sure that our papers are up to snuff with other papers, all right? Making sure that we're following the same formatting. Scientific papers follow the same formatting so that they're easier to read, easier to digest, so that we can find what we're looking for easily when we approach a scientific paper, and we'll come to learn that when we start to read them ourselves. All right, so here's my beautiful infographic to show you what the paper will look like. All right, this is what your paper will roughly look like by the end of the class here. You'll have a title page and an abstract. Those each get their own pages. Then you'll have 5 pages of writing in the body of your paper. We'll call that the body. And that includes the main portions of your paper. So if I hop back to the last slide, that will include your introduction, method, results, and discussion. So those are the main pieces of the paper. That's what will be in your 5 pages of body here. And then we'll have a reference page. So the first paper section that we turn in this class is the reference page, which seems interesting, right? That the very last page would be the first that we complete. But we need to have some reference material before we can start writing. So that'll be our first order of business. But this is what the paper will look like. So now we're going to talk a little bit about APA format and how to list sources and refer to different works in APA format. We're actually working with a new version of APA format. We are on edition 7 for APA, so that is what we will be discussing here. But before we get into APA, we'll talk just a little bit about citing works. Why do we cite? How do we cite? How do we do it well? So the idea is that we will be citing in 2 places. Let me get my head out of here. You'll be citing in 2 places. You'll be citing in the paper when you bring up that person's idea or their results. And you'll also be referencing them on the last page of your paper, that reference page. And again, we'll be doing our reference page separately and first. You'll have a reference page to reference throughout the course. So that's where we'll be citing. We'll have a bibliography or a reference page where all of our references are held, and then as you bring up these ideas in your paper, you will cite inside of your paper. So before we move forward at all, the first thing we really ought to discuss is that we're not simply taking other people's ideas and inserting them into our paper and claiming them as our own, all right? That would be plagiarism. But it's interesting because in scientific writing, we're hoping to just present information in as much of a factual way as possible. So it often seems like, right, we should just take someone else's words and put them into our paper to get across what they're trying to say. But it's really not that clear cut. There's a level of interpretation for us as well. So when you're citing works, you're going to use other people's ideas in your own words, all right? So I have some information here. You have to give credit whenever you use someone's idea. Refer to something that is not common knowledge. And believe it or not, many things are not common knowledge. And I'll be sure to point this out in our papers if we encounter this. But you should have a citation after nearly every sentence, which I know seems crazy. But we'll take a look at what a good introduction section or what a good discussion section that includes references will look like. I have here, you have to use a citation when you quote another person's actual spoken or written words. However, something we'll talk about a little further on here is that in science, we don't quote people very often. We're more likely to be paraphrasing others. You'll have little to no quotes in your paper, all right? And we will, again, continue to talk about that as we go. You'll mostly be paraphrasing another person's spoken or written words. So that's the general idea of where do we cite, why do we cite, how do we cite. So now let's talk a little bit about using APA, all right? Some of the more exciting information we talk about in this class. It's a little dry, right? We're talking about formatting, but we can't forget that the formatting serves a purpose, all right? The uniformity of our references and citations make it easier for other researchers to find and cite work, which makes the entire scientific process easier, all right? So we can't overlook it. All right, so I have a couple examples here. The next couple slides are examples of APA format. So in the text of the paper, if you make a statement like the one I have here, you would put in parentheses after that statement the authors that you got the information from and the year that that information was published. All right, so we have that here. Then on your reference page, I have an outline of the information that's needed as well as this particular example sort of inserted into that outline. So what do we need to include, right? We need to include the author or authors, all right? Sometimes we have one author, sometimes we have many authors, and we'll get into what we do with many authors momentarily here. Authors are listed by last name and their initials, and then we include the year. Year is also very important because year explains when that finding was found, right? Pretty simple idea. Remember that science does work chronologically, right? We build on each other's ideas. So a study that came out this year is going to carry a sort of different weight than a study that came out 30 years ago. And that's important for your reader to know. We include the title of the article in sentence case, meaning you write it like a sentence. The first word will be capitalized and any proper nouns will be capitalized, but otherwise every other piece of the title is lowercase. We have the name of the periodical or the journal. We are mostly going to be citing from journals. So remember all the way back to one of our first topics in the class, we talked about peer review, peer-reviewed articles. That's our sort of highest form of science. That's science that's been graded by other scientists, so to speak. So we want to know what publication this came from and that it's a peer-reviewed publisher, and I'll show you how we find those types of sources in a minute here as well. Then we include the volume and issue number. Most journals will have this structure where they have volumes and issues of their journal. You'll include those here. Page numbers, and then we have what we call a DOI. We'll talk about those in a moment as well. I know you're boiling over with excitement for all these promises I'm making of what we're going to cover. But there we have it. That's what we need in a citation. Citations will vary slightly for things like books, but again, we'll only be citing from very few types of sources because we're only going to be citing from peer-reviewed sources. So again, here we are with an example on the bottom here. It's beautiful, all right? They're so lovely once you have everything in its right place. So let me go ahead and show you this next piece here. This is just showing you each of the separate pieces. showing the author names with their last name and first initial, separated by an ampersand. We have year. We have the article title written like a sentence and sentence case. We have page numbers. We have the journal title, the name of the journal, and then our volume and issue number. I don't have a DOI here, and we'll take a look at that right now. All right. So we'll be pulling from online journals. So a few years ago, all right, DOIs came on the scene. DOIs are an abbreviation for Digital Object Identifiers. So it's meant to be a very quick way for individuals to find articles in the electronic format. All right, so these were the hot new thing a couple years ago, but surprisingly they're not used as often as you might think, but we will learn how to use them because they're promising anyway in the digital age. They're unique identifiers for a book or an article. It's similar to like an ISBN number or a barcode for an article, so it's unique, and if you have it, you should be able to find where that particular information is available online. So again, this is a newer system. We will not require DOIs, but I'll show you a little later on that sometimes DOIs will be provided for you when you have an article, and if you want to use it, we just want to make sure we're using it correctly. And this is an update from a previous version of APA. So if you're familiar with APA version 6 or edition 6, in edition 7 we do have a change here where the DOI is actually listed as a hyperlink. It's listed as a website link instead of just identifying the number of the DOI. So I have an example here, all right? It'll look something like this. So we have kind of the shell here, author, year, publication, title of the article, journal name, volume, issue, everything that we talked about in the last slide. And then at the end, you would include your DOI and it will look like a link, all right? Like a link to a website. So I have an example down here. All right, so the idea is, of course, if someone's using your paper in a digital format and they have your reference page, they can just click to your references right away, which is really great. But again, this system hasn't been broadly used just yet, so it's still gaining its footing. But good to know what they are, good to know how to use them. All right, so we're going to talk about a few other just cases or scenarios when it comes to citing information. Sometimes no author will be listed. Sometimes we have works that come from either so many authors or collaborators that they're simply not listed. Or we have other cases in which an author is not listed, but say an agency or an organization is listed. So here's a major example and something that many of us might choose to cite in our particular papers. Something like the DSM. And if we're not familiar with the DSM, that's our Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's how we diagnose any mental disorders, all right? It's a big book which lists all of the different criteria and symptoms that are needed for a diagnosis of any of our psychological disorders. So maybe you want to cite it, right? Maybe you want to cite which of those symptoms are present in whatever it is you're researching. There's not a single author for the DSM because it's a body of large contributors that put their information into the DSM. So you would just be citing the association that it belongs to, which is the APA, right? The American Psychological Association. And you would put them in place of the author. You would still include the year, and it would look something like this. Right. All right. So when we're using citations in text, meaning in the body of your paper, all right, so you make a statement and then you want to cite it. There are a few ways to do this. So I mentioned one where you make the statement and then in parentheses after your statement, you put in the author names and the year. Or you can embed that information into your writing. You can say instead of citing after, list those authors before you run into the statement you're going to make. So this is where scientific writing sort of meets other types of writing you've maybe learned about before. We want our information to have a flow to it, all right? If we were just simply listing off a bunch of information with citations afterwards, the flow would be a little bit hard to read, right? You still want a narrative to your paper. So we'll be looking at examples of this, and you'll be reading papers yourself and you'll see this in action. But just keep in mind that there's more than one way to get an in-text citation across. All right, so here's another specific scenario. If you have lots of authors, all right, sometimes papers have many, many, many authors. So there's a new rule, this is also new to the 7th edition, where when you have to cite more than 3 authors, all right, so here's an example of a paper with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 authors. You would go ahead and put this into your paper, all right? You would list all of the authors on your reference page, but in text you would do something different. So on the bottom here I have an example. You would write the first author's name followed by the words et al. And then the year. All right, so we've maybe heard this term before. What does et al. Mean? So maybe it means I do not like APA style at all. Okay, a joke. But what it really means is and others or and colleagues, meaning that we have a head author on that particular paper and then there are others as well. And if you're interested in who those others are, you can go to the reference page and find them. All right, so that's the general idea here. Again, if you're adjusting from our previous version of APA, it used to be such that on your first citation in the paper, you had to list all authors that were listed in the reference at the end of the paper, and then subsequent citations would have et al. But that has now changed, all right? On your first citation, you can use et al. For authors 3 or more, for papers with authors of 3 or more, or books with authors of 3 or more. So if this is your first time with APA and you're like, I don't care about the old edition, then just, ignore what I said. This is what we do, all right? We use et al. When we have more than 3 authors. All right. So just another scenario, and there are hundreds of different scenarios you can run into when you're citing papers, things like citing papers that have, or 2 different papers that have the same set of authors that were published in the same year. There are lots of interesting scenarios we can encounter, and that's what the link to the APA website is there to help you with. If you encounter anything that's abnormal, it can help you to determine what you need to do in that particular scenario. But I'm going over some of the more common ones. So here's another. Maybe you're making a statement in which you have 2 different sources that would contribute to that statement. Then you would just cite both, all right? So I have here an example of that, right? Maybe you're citing the prevalence of a certain disorder. You could cite the DSM, right, through the APA, and maybe another paper mentions it as well, right, through their own research. So you can mention them both separated by semicolons. This is not limited to 2 papers. You can have 3 papers or 3 sources that point to the same idea, and you could do this here. All right. So now we're kind of out of the woods with the APA. We'll be practicing APA throughout the course, writing our paper. But let's talk a little bit more about how to write a research paper, all right, since we're going to be doing it. We're going to start with reading articles, all right? So we want to become literate in our topic, all right? So this whole topic we're on right now is called scientific literacy. It's about understanding or being literate in a certain topic. So how you start doing that is by collecting sources and taking notes, all right? Kind of writing down or creating a sort of a series of thoughts that are all linked together by the different sources that you have read. All right, so I include here, do not directly quote authors, okay? So like I said, there might be an opportunity somewhere in your paper where you might quote somebody maybe once, but beyond that, we do not quote regularly in scientific writing. So this might be very different than other writing that you have done in the past, all right? So we do not want to get in the habit of quoting authors, all right? We want to get in the habit of writing down thoughts in our own words, explaining them how we understand them. So that'll be our first step. It'll be collecting some sources, taking notes on those ideas to get us ready to write the introduction to our topic, which is just that. It introduces what's known about that topic and what you intend to investigate. So this is sort of our first step here. All right, so take notes in your own words, okay? We write in present tense, all right? It's another little scientific writing rule. If you're citing a paper, right, I have an example here of a 2015 paper. 2015 is in the past, right? So it might seem logical to write in the past tense when you're referring to this paper. But when a paper is published, right, that's the best of our knowledge at that time. So that paper will state or contend something in particular. And we'll talk about it as if it is still true. All right, and then what we could do, right, if a paper has since been disproven or sort of challenged by another paper, we can talk about what that paper states or contends. It's possible to find conflicting information out there. There are plenty of topics where scientists disagree, but we will write about their thoughts in the present tense, and you will write about them in your own words, citing like this, right? You'll say what they stated, what they contend, in your own words, through your own understanding. All right, so one of my favorite analogies here, let me get my head out of the way. Doing research is sort of like being a lawyer, all right? So I have kind of a multiple step analogy here. So as a lawyer, right, and I have some symbols here. We have the scales of justice, and then we have this funky Greek letter, which is the Greek letter psi, which is the symbol for psychology, all right? So as a lawyer, right, you frame a case, you search for evidence, you present the evidence, and then you make a closing argument, right? You make sort of a conclusion about the case. And research is not much different, all right? You start by defining your topic or framing your case. You perform the research, right? You're seeking out that evidence, all right, to support or not support your claim. You write the paper, you present it, and you draw a conclusion, all right? You determine whether or not your hypothesis was supported or not. And if we remember back to hypotheses in our previous topics, we always have an alternative or a research hypothesis, and only one of two things can happen, all right? We can have support for it or not, all right? And we're doing that based on probability and hypothesis testing, all of which we will continue to elaborate on in this course. So I think this is a helpful way to think about it here. All right, so some other general tips on scientific writing. I just cannot get my head in a place where I'm not blocking something. Scientific writing is formal, all right, so we want to treat it that way. So we avoid things like abbreviations, or at least we define abbreviations before we use them. All right, don't just start using org if you haven't, say, already elaborated on what that is previously. We avoid contractions. This is a big one because a lot of us naturally write with contractions, right? Things like it's, can't. But we avoid this in general. We get rid of our contractions. Hopefully the dog noises aren't too distracting for you right now. So we avoid casual language, things like this is interesting because, or this interests me because, or in science, plenty of things are interesting, all right, but we don't report them as being interesting, all right? We want to report them in terms of the information that's present, not what we think about it, all right? How we interpret it can be included, but what we think about it should not be included. And then avoiding self-reference. And this is actually a little bit complicated because this has changed in recent years. We actually seem to be more accepting of the word we in science, all right? So it used to be something like this. If the study was distributing a survey, you would write that up as the researchers distributed a survey. But now it's becoming a little more welcome that we can do something like we distributed the survey. So this is new to APA format. However, I will still advise or suggest that you avoid self-reference whenever possible. Because it's very easy to slip into casual language when you're referencing yourself. All right, so remember that whatever makes it onto your page should be professional. All right, there shouldn't be any casual language talking about yourself or why you chose that topic. If you want to talk to me about that, that's fine. But if you're writing it up in a formal research report, it doesn't necessarily belong, all right? So there are plenty of things we want to avoid, and these are just some of them. All right, and the last bit we'll talk about is the literature search. So you all will be searching out resources for your paper. All right, so we're going to do what we call a literature review, where you're going to search for sources. So in addition to this recording that you're watching now, there will be a sort of counterpart to this, where depending on what institution you're at, I'll provide instructions about how to access databases with scientifically sound sources, peer-reviewed sources. So be on the lookout for that. But generally, all right, when we embark on that search, we want to start out very broadly about our particular topic. We also want to start with recent work. So we'll talk about why both of these things are important. So let's take a topic, a very general topic, all right, or a broad topic. Let's start with anxiety, all right? So anxiety is a major psychological disorder. It's very prevalent. Many people suffer with anxiety. So say that you want to use this as a topic in your paper. All right, so maybe you're interested in specifically test anxiety in women of the college age group. All right, maybe that's what you want to investigate. But before you can investigate that, you need to have a broad understanding of what anxiety is, right? Or maybe define anxiety for your reader. So it's always good to start broad, start with some of the general research on the topic. We also want to start with recent work. We talk about how year is important to state in a reference. And it's important because it places that piece of science in time, all right? Again, citing something from this year is very different than citing something from the 1970s. But starting with recent work lets you know where the field has left off, all right? What's the most cutting edge research in that field? That'll be the newest research in that field. So start broad, start general, and start with recent work, and then you can sort of work into more focused information from there, and you can work into older work from there as well. And I have this, let me figure out where to put my head. We'll go right here. I think this really helps us to understand this. So a literature review is going to inform your introduction, all right, the introduction to your topic. You're going to review the literature and you're going to write up an introduction to your topic that's going to end with your specific study and your hypothesis. So with this, we start broad, okay, and then we narrow down to our specific interest. So we can take the same logic for our literature review as well. So I think we should think of this as a sort of funnel. And I'll bring up later that the rest of the research, right, the rest of the report, it looks sort of like an hourglass, all right? We get very focused, and we focus in when we do our results, and then we sort of re-broaden our horizons here. So you'll see that, you will see or have seen that in another one of our lectures here, on that sort of hourglass shape where we start broad and then we get more narrow. And that's in order to inform the reader of the general ideas that you'll be addressing that lead into your particular topic. All right, so this is our last bit here on just general search strategy. We'll be using a search strategy that will only yield us scholarly articles, all right? And by scholarly, we mean peer-reviewed, we mean professional. So there's some information on that here. We're just trying to provide information that's as unbiased as possible. And there's, of course, bias in science as well. We can find bias in our scientific papers, but the peer review process is meant to eliminate that as much as we can. So remember that peer-reviewed articles are usually of higher quality. They've been overviewed by other professionals in the field. It's sort of like grading. It's like grading their work, right? Scientists grading other scientists. So that's what we'll be looking for. We'll be looking for peer-reviewed papers because that's our best quality science. All right, everybody, that concludes our scientific literacy and intro to our paper. Remember, there will be a second piece to this, which will go over how you at your particular institution will access these types of sources. All right, I will see you all over on the next lecture.